Hi, hello, what's up? Good evening, good morning, good day, whatever. Um, Hi. I am Jolly Squid Studios, and today's video is going to be a little different. Today, I am starting work on my dream game. This video is just going to give you an overview of my idea so far. It's a little rough around the edges, but I'll nail it down as I go. So basically, the one sentence pitch is that it's a first-person shooter with a dungeon master. Me and my little brothers play a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, and we also play a lot of video games. And I've always loved the world building part. I'm pretty consistently the dungeon master when we play Dungeons and Dragons. And I've tried to find a game that allows for that sort of world creation and improvisation, the same sort of crafting of an experience that Dungeons and Dragons does, but it doesn't seem like there are any. I know Arma 3's got a similar mode, but the editor is really complicated and there's a lot it can't do. So I figured I'd make my own. If you don't know what a Dungeon Master is, basically in Dungeons and Dragons there are two types of people. There's the players who control a character in the game, and there's the Dungeon Master who controls the world. The players say what their character does. They say, I attack the goblin, or I open the door. And the Dungeon Master decides, either by the roll of dice or just by saying that you don't need a skill check to open a door, how that action impacts the world. And there's a lot of really complicated systems out there for figuring out how different actions impact different things and dice rolls and calculations, and I figured it'd be easier to just simulate it as a video game. Allow the player's actions to map directly onto the character by letting them play as the character. And the Dungeon Master just has to have access to a game engine of sorts that runs while the game is running. Now obviously we'll have to create, different things that the Dungeon Master can use, but I do plan to keep the editor pretty simple so as not to overwhelm new players. I want to make this accessible, since that's the problem with all the complicated role-playing systems. So, a more complicated overview of my game idea. You play as either a player or the Dungeon Master. The Dungeon Master has access to a real-time editor and a variety of different modules that they can place to create and shape the world as the players explore it. So the Dungeon Master can create a more dynamic and intuitive world than any video game ever could. And the players play just like any other video game, running around and shooting at enemies and following directions from their HUD, except that it's infinitely more intricate because it's created by a human player every time you play the game. I also plan to include different genres, so you should be able to set it to a sci-fi setting or a modern military setting, and I'd really like to have fantasy, but I don't know how realistic that is. Melee combat systems are really hard to do right, but having the callback to this game's D&D origins would be nice. The game starts with you joining a server. The players are put in a small training area or, a blank room with different weapons and targets. Just something to do while the Dungeon Master sets up the world. And while the players are playing around in there, the Dungeon Master starts building. First, they set up parameters for the world generation. Every time you play, you're going to randomly generate a map. The first thing the Dungeon Master needs to do is decide how the landscape looks. How tall are the mountains, how low are the valleys, and how far apart are they from each other. And then they can choose a terrain texture, such as sand, grass. Next, nature. They need to decide on a tree, prefab, or several that will be randomly spaced out about the landscape. After that, they do civilization. So roads, cities, I do have a good idea for city generation. The Dungeon Master will need to input the average size of a city, the frequency of these cities across the map, and the type of city. So cities are generated by having an area, and a bunch of buildings are randomly placed in that area with roads going through them, but the Dungeon Master can decide on a type of city, such as a colony, factory, metropolis, military encampment, whatever. They just choose which building prefabs are used in the random generation of the city. This way the Dungeon Master can have the buildings match the terrain better, or they can have them fit the story they're trying to tell by having them be huge factories or enemy bases. And then occupancy. I'm not really sure if I'm going to do this one. It's a little more complicated than I would like, but I think it should be an option for the Dungeon Master to randomly generate civilians and wildlife units from the red and blue teams. The Dungeon Master should be able to decide how common civilians and animals and red and blue units are in cities and encampments, and then they should be able to determine how well armed the different armies are, how good Red's weapons are, or how common vehicles are in their encampments. So after they enter all these parameters, they just press go, and it randomly builds the world. At this point, the DM can either refine the world that they generated by placing certain cities or vehicles or military forces that they need to have for their mission, or they can just go straight to placing the player's spawn point. Now there are two ways to do spawn points. You can either assign each player to a unit that's already on the field and have them take over that AI, or you can place a spawn point. The advantage of a spawn point is that it allows the players to choose their loadout and customize their character, and also you can check a little tick box that allows the players to respawn, which would be useful if you're doing a more arcade-like game. So after they've got all the world set up and the players spawned in, they need to start building the mission. These would be comprised of objectives. Objectives will show up on the player's UI to tell them what they need to do, and also the enemy AI is driven by these objectives. They can be win conditions, like clear all the enemies out of this area within this time limit, or lose conditions, like if this unit dies, you lose, so you need to protect it. And then you can just let the game play out. The Dungeon Master can sit back and watch their creation unfold, or they can possess a unit to fight against the players, they can possess a unit on the friendly team to play with the other players, or they can improvise and create more mission as the players are playing the old one. I know this idea is ambitious, like really, really ambitious, but it's an idea I've had for a long time, and since I started making, little prototype video games about a year ago, I've learned some skills that I think would help me accomplish this. So I've decided I'm going to start working on it. I have almost no idea where to start, but I figured the first place would be to nail down all the ideas I have. This game is super, super early. Like, it doesn't even have a project folder yet. So if you guys have any ideas you'd like to add to the game, please leave them in the comments. I appreciate you guys watching.